The golden hour light always felt like a rendering error to me, a trick of atmospheric refraction painting the dust above the old family farm in warm, impossible copper. I stood in the gravel driveway, the dry earth crunching beneath the heavy soles of my boots, feeling the heavy, analog silence of the evening press against my shoulders. The air was thick with the scent of dry cedar and sun-baked soil, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled server rooms I usually inhabited. Coming out here was supposed to be a chance to disconnect, to step away from the endless streams of predictive models, neural networks, and server arrays that dictated my existence in the city. The logistics mistake bringing me to this specific plot of land, a double-booked, short-term rental algorithm that failed to update its availability calendar, felt like a glitch in the matrix, a random variable throwing me off my calculated path. But the heavy, peaceful atmosphere was suddenly fractured by the crunch of tires on gravel. An old, faded red pickup truck rattled up the drive and shifted into park. A weathered man in his late 60s stepped out, his denim overalls covered in the pale dust of the fields. It was Elias, Kamiyah's closest neighbor and the unofficial patriarch of this stretch of the valley. He walked toward the open doorway of the silver RV parked at the edge of the sprawling apple orchard, a crumpled piece of printer paper clutched in his rough hand. Staying back by my car, I avoided intruding, but the evening air carried their voices perfectly. "They locked me out, Cam," Elias said, his voice stripped of its usual booming warmth. "The Apex portal. It says my account is flagged for asset review. The operating loan is frozen." Kamiyah stepped into the doorway, her silhouette tight against the fading light. She wore a simple white tank top and gray cotton shorts. She took the paper, her eyes scanning the text rapidly. "Elias, this is an automated default notice. You haven't missed a yield target in 40 years. "Doesn't matter to the machine," Elias replied, rubbing a hand over his tired face. His shoulders sagged, a physical manifestation of a man surrendering to a force he couldn't punch, plow, or outwork. I called the corporate number, sat on hold for 2 hours just to have an automated voice tell me my acreage is mathematically unviable. I can't buy seed for the lower 40. I'm too old to fight corporate lawyers, Kamiyah. The developers made an offer on the South Ridge last month. I think I'm just going to sign it. I'm done." He didn't wait for her to argue. Turning around, he walked back to his truck and drove away, leaving a plume of dust hanging in the still air. Kamiyah stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, watching the road. Then, a low, rhythmic sound began echoing from the RV. The frantic, uneven tapping of a laptop keyboard. I stepped closer, my dark t-shirt absorbing the residual heat of the afternoon sun. Her knuckles were white as her right hand gripped the edge of the doorframe. It looked as if the thin metal was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. Her eyes looked hollowed out by a sudden, invisible gravity. Glancing past my shoulder toward the empty county road to ensure Elias's taillights were truly gone, she leaned in. The scent of stale, cold coffee drifted from the camper, mixing with the sharp tang of ozone from a struggling generator. She pulled me aside, stepping just out of the line of sight from the small tinted windows, and whispered, "If anyone sees this, it'll look wrong." My boots stopped moving. Instinctively, my hands found the pockets of my jeans, anchoring my thumbs against the rough denim. The evening breeze shifted the leaves in the orchard behind me, a random, organic variable impossible to predict. Looking over her shoulder, my gaze landed on the dark screen of the laptop resting on a small, unsteady folding table behind her. It was displaying the same corporate vendor portal Elias had mentioned, the screen dominated by glaring red error banners that pulsed like warning flares. Letting an unregistered, out-of-state data scientist access a highly proprietary agricultural supply chain network was a direct, actionable violation of her vendor terms. It was a digital trespass that could terminate her operating contracts instantly, effectively ending her farm right alongside Elias's. Keeping my voice steady, I lowered its volume to match the quiet of the dusk, ensuring I didn't add to her panic. I asked, "Should I leave?" Kamiyah let out a shaky exhale, her fingers twisting a plain silver band on her right hand. "No," she said, her voice barely carrying over the low, vibrating hum of the RV's small generator. "No, Finn. I think I'm losing the farm, and it's happening on a screen, and I don't even know what language it's speaking." Stepping back, she allowed the physical space between us to widen, opening a narrow path into the wood-paneled interior. The problem she was facing wasn't dirt, drought, or blight. It was a logistics mistake. A cascading data failure in a system beyond her reach. A massive, automated scheduling algorithm utilized by Apex AgCorp had misclassified her seasonal harvest yield, flagging her account for immediate contractual default. As I walked up the 3 metal steps, the aluminum groaned slightly beneath my weight. The interior of the RV felt like a pressured submarine, tight, claustrophobic, and filled with the ambient static of impending financial ruin. Rather than sitting down immediately, I stood in the narrow aisle and observed her. She was 36, carrying the weight of 4 generations of agricultural history on her shoulders, and right now, she was being systematically dismantled by a line of code she couldn't even see. I set my heavy canvas laptop bag on the linoleum floor. The dull thud seemed to ground the room slightly. "Show me the dashboard," I said quietly, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Walking back to the folding table, she turned the screen toward me. The dashboard was a masterclass in hostile user experience, a mess of obfuscated metrics, locked drop-down menus, and nested tables designed to intimidate the user into submission. "They withheld the quarterly payment," she said, her voice tightening as she pointed a slightly trembling finger to a flashing 0 in the top right corner. Elias warned me about the new automated vendor system they rolled out last month, but I thought it was just a processing delay. Now my portal looks exactly like his. The operating loan is locked, pending asset review. The debt collection protocol triggers on the 15th. The antagonist wasn't a person we could yell at or reason with. It was an algorithm, a cold, faceless sequence of logic gates that had parsed her data and decided her family's legacy was mathematically unviable. Crossing her arms tightly over her chest, she shivered despite the residual warmth trapped in the aluminum cabin. I almost reached out. The urge to place a hand on her shoulder, to physically steady the tremor I saw in her posture, was a sudden, heavy pull in my chest. Instead, my hands went deeper into my pockets, knuckles pressing hard against the fabric until it slightly ached. My focus shifted entirely to the machine. Romance, right now, was useless. Competence was required. "It's just data, Kamiyah," I murmured, my voice a flat, calm baseline designed to counteract her rising panic. "And data is just a series of choices made by flawed human architects. We just need to find the specific choice it got wrong." Once I retrieved my own machine from the canvas bag, the high-end, matte black processing rig looked entirely out of place next to her worn, handwritten ledgers and stacks of paper receipts. The sudden glow of my terminal window cast a stark, sharp blue light across the cramped table, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. "I need to route your connection through my proxy," I explained, the tone shifting effortlessly into the dry, methodical rhythm of my trade. "I'm going to run a diagnostic script to monitor the exact API calls their portal is making to the central server when it rejects your credentials." Without waiting for a long, philosophical debate about the ethics of data scraping, I bypassed the hesitation. When I opened a shell script, the network packets began tracing across the screen. Isolating the JSON payloads returned by the Apex servers allowed me to watch the data stream in raw text format. By monitoring the latency spikes, the exact moment the server handshake failed became clear. Within 80 seconds, the pattern emerged. The anomaly lay buried deep in the header files. The algorithm wasn't actually evaluating her physical crop yield or her bank statements. It was pulling a deprecated metadata tag from an outdated county zoning database that falsely listed her specific acreage coordinates as inactive commercial, rather than active agricultural. My fingers stopped typing. The complex, multi-layered problem had been diagnosed in minutes, exposing what their automated, multi-million-dollar system had misread. When I finally looked up from the screen, Kamiyah was watching my face intently. Her breath was held, her eyes searching mine for any sign of a verdict. "It's a mapping error," I said simply, leaning back slightly. "A ghost in their machine. They're starving you out over a bad variable. The system thinks you are trying to farm an abandoned parking lot, so it automatically flagged the harvest data as fraudulent." She closed her eyes, and a profound, visible relief washed over her features. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The tension in the room didn't vanish entirely, but it shifted dramatically from a chaotic, unwinnable storm into a definable, navigable road. "So we just tell them?" she asked, opening her eyes. "We just call them and tell them the map is wrong?" Shaking my head slowly, I clarified the reality. You can't just tell an algorithm it's wrong. You have to prove it using its own logic. We need to build a data set, that forces it to correct itself. The next few days became an intense study in forced proximity and methodical, quiet resistance. The RV became our command center, an isolated, glowing node fighting against a massive corporate network. Outside, the farm continued its slow, analog cycles. The wind moved through the apple trees, and the distant sound of a tractor maintained the organic rhythm of a world that didn't care about code. But inside the aluminum walls, a digital war of attrition waged on. The space was far too small for grand gestures or sweeping declarations. We lived in the spaces between words. Our routines synced in quiet, entirely unspoken ways. When deep into an audit of the server logs, eyes burning from the screen glare while mapping the routing protocols, my hand would reach out blindly to find a fresh cup of coffee waiting exactly where expected. When she fell asleep at the folding table, cheek resting against the rough paper of her grandfather's ledgers, I would silently stand up and adjust the small electric space heater. Angling it perfectly toward her legs insulated her against the dropping night chill without ever crossing a physical boundary. One afternoon, the corporate vendor representative, a mid-level manager named Trent, who hid behind automated, template emails, sent a formal, digitally signed refusal to lift the account freeze. He cited system integrity protocols and inflexible algorithmic compliance guidelines. Kamiyah stood by the small kitchenette, reading the message on her phone. Staring at the email on her screen, her shoulders slumped forward, as if the physical weight of 4 generations of agricultural history had just crushed her spine. Reaching out, she gripped the frayed leather cover of her grandfather's old ledger resting on the counter, knuckles turning bone white against the binding. The analog world she understood was being deleted by a machine she couldn't fight. She was watching her legacy evaporate into the cloud. "Maybe I should just accept the buyout offer they attached to the bottom of the email," she said quietly, her voice devoid of its usual fight. Setting the phone face down on the laminate counter, she let out a slow sigh. Elias was right. I don't have the capital or the lawyers to fight a corporate legal department. I'm just a farmer, Finn. I know dirt. I know when it's going to rain by the smell of the air. I don't know data. I don't know how to fight a ghost. She was trying to push me away, isolating herself to absorb the impact of the loss alone. I didn't argue with her fear or offer empty motivational speeches. Leaning against the doorframe, my posture remained deliberately relaxed, refusing to adopt her panic. "You're not fighting a legal department," I said, the words low and even, designed to cut through her spiral. "You're fighting a poorly optimized sorting algorithm written by a junior developer who has probably never touched a patch of dirt in his life. And algorithms don't have lawyers. They have parameters. They have rules." Walking over to the coffee pot, I poured a cup of the dark, bitter brew she kept running all day. Setting it down gently on the counter next to her hand, the ceramic clinked softly against the laminate. It was a domestic anchor, a small, repeating routine we had established. Providing the warmth when the air grew too cold didn't require questions. Stepping back immediately gave her the necessary space. I forced the heavy urge to stay into rigid professionalism. The need to hold her, to shield her physically from the overwhelming stress, was a constant gravity in my chest. But touching her now wouldn't pay the debt or fix the code. It would only complicate her sanctuary. Sitting back down at my terminal, my eyes locked onto the cascading lines of code. "I'm going to write a script to scrape their public directory," I told her. "If their zoning API is pulling bad data for you and Elias, it's statistically highly probable it's pulling bad data for others in this county. We find the pattern, we map the step-by-step logic failure across multiple accounts, and we break the lock with a class action threat they can't ignore." Work continued late into the night. The hum of the generator was a constant companion, a steady vibration beneath the thin floorboards. Sitting across from me, she reviewed decades of handwritten ledgers, checking her analog reality against their digital fiction, meticulously building a timeline of her yields. Opposite her, my Python script bypassed the API rate limits of the county database without triggering their security flags. Handling the complex software with expert fluency kept my fingers moving across the keys with a rhythmic certainty. Her gaze fell on me occasionally, not out of impatience or expectation, but carrying a quiet, growing respect. Refusing to make her feel like a burden, no complaints about the grueling hours or the stale air left my lips. Staying present was the only objective. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped sharply. I noticed she had stopped turning the pages of her ledger. Her head rested against the cold window pane, eyes closed, deep exhaustion pulling at her features. Pausing my work, I stood up silently, retrieved the heavy woolen blanket from the back bunk, and draped it over the back of her chair. Respecting the boundary of her sleep meant not draping it over her shoulders, but the weight of the fabric against the chair successfully blocked the draft. Returning to my seat allowed the coating to resume. The silence in the RV was thick, but it was no longer heavy. It was steady. It was the first time in my life my calculations were actually building a foundation instead of predicting a theoretical collapse. But the relief was temporary. The abstract digital problem manifested as a physical, immediate crisis 2 days later. While I was compiling the data logs into a visual format at the RV's table, the sound of the main irrigation pump, a steady, rhythmic thumping that had become background noise, suddenly ground to a halt. The silence in the orchard was immediate, absolute, and terrifying. Kamiyah burst out of the back door of the main house across the gravel drive, sprinting toward the pump station at the edge of the field. Abandoning my laptop instantly, the screen still glowing, I followed her, my boots kicking up clouds of dry dust in the oppressive midday heat. Reaching the small, cinder-block pump house, she was staring in horror at the digital interface of the PLC mounted on the wall above the massive steel pipes. The screen flashed a bright, angry red text. Vendor lock, Apex Ag Corp automation protocol initiated. They cut the water, she said, her voice completely hollow. The smart irrigation system is leased through their hardware division. It's tied to the vendor portal. Because the operating account is frozen, the algorithm triggered a hardware lock on the main valve. If these trees don't get watered by noon today, the blossoms will drop. I lose the crop anyway. The algorithm figured out a way to kill the farm before the deadline. Her shoulders sank, her eyes locked on the heavy steel pipes as if trying to will the water to flow through sheer force of desperation. Go back to the RV, I said. The command sharp enough to cut through her downward spiral. Bring me my laptop and the blue toolkit from the bottom of my bag. Run. Surprised by the absolute authority in the instruction, she didn't argue. Approaching the PLC box, I analyzed the standard industrial unit, likely running a modified, highly secure Linux kernel. When Kamiyah returned, breathless and handing over the laptop, empty reassurances were kept at bay. Raw competence was the only appropriate response. Opening the blue toolkit, I extracted a specialized USB to RS-232 serial cable and used a multi-tool to unscrew the heavy metal faceplate of the controller. They locked the software remotely via the cellular network, I explained, my hands moving with practiced efficiency to connect the machine directly to the motherboard's diagnostic port. But the hardware relays still have to obey local, hardwired commands. I just need to spoof the handshake protocol. Dropping to a crouch on the dirt floor, I balanced the laptop on my knee. A terminal window flared to life as I began feeding hex codes directly into the controller's memory registers. Bypassing the cellular authentication module completely, I ignored the system warnings flooding the screen. Finding the specific memory address controlling the main water relay allowed me to force a state change. It took exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds of absolute, unbroken focus. With the final strike of the Enter key, a heavy, satisfying metallic clack echoed loudly inside the cinderblock walls. Immediately following was the deep, resonant roar of thousands of gallons of water rushing through the steel pipes. Outside, the sprinkler heads in the orchard hissed to life, casting wide, sweeping arcs of water into the dry, hot air. Unplugging the cable, I wrapped it neatly and stood up, brushing the dirt from the knees of my jeans. Offering no smile or look for validation, I handled the complex tool with expert fluency, proving the truth by demonstration. Kamiyah stared at the rushing water, then slowly turned her attention back to me. The look in her eyes carried a profound, undeniable respect. She saw the raw, functional power of the technical fix. Watching her shoulders relax signaled the heavy burden of the immediate drought lifting. Handing her the metal faceplate and the screws, I spoke quietly. The water is yours again. Let's get back to the code. That afternoon, the reality of the situation forced us into town. The pump's manual override had blown a physical relay fuse that needed replacing before nightfall to ensure the system didn't overload. Riding in her dusty Ford pickup, the bench seat worn down on the driver's side felt different now. The silence between us in the cab wasn't the awkwardness of strangers. It was the quiet, shared space of a partnership. Walking into the local hardware store, the air smelled strongly of chemical fertilizer and cut pine lumber. While Kamiyah stood at the front counter, negotiating with the clerk for a highly specific, high-amperage industrial fuse, I waited near the back aisles, examining a rack of heavy-duty zip ties. That's when the conversation caught my ear. Two men in plaid work shirts were leaning against an end cap, voices kept low but perfectly audible over the store radio. Heard Apex is calling Kamiyah's notes in early, one of them muttered, adjusting a grease-stained baseball cap. Elias is already packing up his equipment down the road. Shame. Her grandfather would have never let the debt get out of hand like that. Guess the girl just couldn't manage the logistics. Knew it was too much farm for her. My jaw locked. The muscles in my forearms tightened, but I kept my breathing slow and measured. Refusing to march over and shout, I avoided causing a scene that would embarrass her. Adhering strictly to the protective defense protocol, I walked slowly over to the end cap, picking up a box of standard fuses right next to them. At first, my gaze remained fixed on the shelves. It's an API failure, actually, I said, the tone carrying the casual, undeniable authority of someone who knows exactly the mechanics of the failure. The two men stopped talking instantly, turning to stare and size me up. Turning my head, I met the gaze of the man in the cap dead on. Apex Ag Corp pushed a faulty software update to their vendor portal last month. It pulled corrupted county zoning metadata from an archival server. It's affecting 12 different farms in this specific quadrant, including Elias Vance's property. But Miss Hughes was the first owner competent enough to audit their code and identify the breach. She's currently forcing their corporate office into a manual system rollback to prevent them from facing a massive class action data negligence lawsuit. Holding his gaze without blinking, I proved the truth with measurable reality, utilizing terminology that was too specific and technical to be a lie. The public insult was shut down cleanly, protecting her reputation in a room where she couldn't hear the defense. "Oh," the man stammered, shifting his weight uncomfortably, clearly intimidated by the absolute certainty of the facts. I didn't know that. We just heard." "You heard wrong," I stated softly, leaving absolutely no room for debate or follow-up questions. Turning away, I walked back to the front counter, my pulse steadying as the two men stood in silence. Kamiyah was waiting. The new relay fused safely inside a small brown paper bag. She offered a small, tired curve of her lips that made the rigid discipline in my chest ache with a sudden intensity. Keeping what had just happened to myself, I sought no credit. Instead, I placed my hand lightly on the small of her back, a brief, grounding touch, completely functional and non-sexual, and guided her toward the glass exit doors. "Let's go fix the pump," I said. The midpoint twist arrived the following Thursday morning, harsh and uncompromising. An automated alert chimed on both our devices simultaneously. It was a complete, hard financial freeze. Apex Ag Corp had triggered a secondary, automated clause in the vendor agreement due to prolonged algorithmic instability. Moving to seize the farm's operating account entirely by 5 p.m. that same day accelerated the timeline without human oversight. The 12-day cushion evaporated instantly. Standing up from the small kitchenette, a ceramic mug slipped from Kamiyah's numb fingers, shattering on the linoleum. The sharp crash was deafening in the small space. Color drained completely from her face. "They're locking the bank," she whispered, staring at the notification on her phone as if it were a loaded weapon. "Finn, if they lock the bank today, the payroll bounces. The suppliers recall the seed. The farm dies at 5 p.m. The analog world she understood was being deleted by a machine she couldn't fight. She stepped toward me, her hands trembling violently, a sharp, broken exhale escaping her lips. Rising from the table, I closed the distance between us. She reached out first, her hands grasping my forearms with a desperate strength. Adhering strictly to the principle of the stabilizer prevented me from pulling her into a romantic embrace. Standing perfectly still allowed my physical presence to act as a grounding wire. Locking my muscles created a rigid, unyielding pillar for her to hold onto in the storm. "Breathe," I said, the quiet command cutting through the static of her fear. "Just breathe. Feel the floor." End quote. The transfer of stability was slow but immediate. The violent tremor in her hands slowly subsided as she absorbed the calm forced into my own pulse. The RV around us felt completely silent, the chaos of the financial threat blocked out by the simple, steady geometry of our stance. "I am afraid," she confessed, her voice cracking. The fierce independence in her posture finally cracking under the weight of the digital threat. Gently disengaging my arms from her grip, I stepped back to the laptop to break the emotional intensity and focus on practical survival. "You aren't losing the dirt," I said, the cadence dropping into the flat, commanding tone of a systems administrator executing a hard reset. Reaching over, I picked up her phone from the table and pressed it firmly into her palm. "The machine is executing a flawed script. We have the data to break it. Call Trent. Make him look at the logs right now." Hesitating for a fraction of a second, she wiped a stray tear from her cheek with the back of her hand, then nodded. Her posture straightened as her fingers gripped the phone, the warrior returning, armed with the weapon built together over the past weeks. As she navigated the corporate phone tree, fighting through layers of automated routing, the final data extraction finished compiling. A massive, indisputable log file now showed the exact routing errors, the false metadata tags, the corrupted historical data, and the timeline of the automated failure. Formatted into a clean, irrefutable PDF document, it mapped a step-by-step plan proving their algorithm was executing an unlawful seizure based on corrupted inputs. It wasn't magic. It was math. It was undeniable proof of systemic negligence. When Trent finally answered, his voice carried the bureaucratic indifference of a man who rarely had to face the consequences of his software. "Miss Hughes, as I've stated repeatedly via email, the system determines the asset viability. There is no manual override for an automated default. The parameters are set. The buyout offer is still on the table until 5 p.m. Check your inbox," Kamiyah interrupted. Her voice was no longer shaking. It was forged steel. Producing the documentation revealed the antagonist's manipulation, allowing her to step fully into her power moment. Taking absolute command of her own survival required no permission or prompting from me. "I just sent you a 60-page diagnostic of your own API architecture. Your algorithm is classifying agricultural zones based on an outdated county subroutine that was officially retired a decade ago. You are unlawfully holding my funds based on a software bug, and you are about to trigger a fraudulent foreclosure." A long silence stretched over the line. Watching Kamiyah's face revealed sheer magnificence. Standing tall in the cramped RV with her shoulders squared, she fought a multi-million-dollar corporation with nothing but a cellular connection and absolute truth. I am looking at the file now," Trent stammered, the bureaucratic shield cracking instantly as the reality of the data set in. He was looking at his own code's failure. "Where did you get this telemetry? This is internal diagnostic data. Who is running your systems?" "That is irrelevant," she fired back, her tone clipped and fiercely professional. "What is relevant is that if my operating account is frozen at 5 p.m. today, I will submit this log to the Agricultural Oversight Board as proof of systemic vendor fraud. I will show them exactly how your black box destroys solvent farms to force cheap buyouts. Lift the freeze. Now." Frantic typing echoed on the other end of the line. Okay, Miss Hughes. I am initializing a manual override protocol. It will take a moment to push through the servers. And while you're in the manual override," Kamiyah added, unwavering, "you're going to clear the flag on Elias Vance's account on the South Ridge. His acreage shares the exact same corrupted zoning tag. You clear his freeze, or the data still goes to the Oversight Board." "Understood," Trent replied, his voice strained. The climax was a scrapped contract, a digital surrender witnessed through the silence of the phone speaker. Within 10 minutes, Trent bypassed the algorithm entirely to save his own job. The glaring red banners on the portal on my screen blinked out, replaced by the steady, calming green of an active, funded account. A moment later, a confirmation email arrived in Kamiyah's inbox, copying Elias Vance. The immediate threat was neutralized. The system had been beaten by reality. Kamiyah ended the call and placed the phone on the table. Watching the green light on the screen, her attention eventually shifted back to me. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a profound, victorious exhaustion in its wake. Closing my laptop, the snap of the lid echoed loudly in the quiet RV. My job was done. With the logic puzzle solved and the variables corrected, I began to quietly gather my cables, wrapping them with methodical precision. My movements remained deliberate, refusing to linger or expect a reward. Having anchored her through the storm, I recognized my place as just a philosophical drifter. The analog aftermath didn't belong to a man of the cloud. "You're packing up," she noted, the hum of the generator suddenly very loud in the absence of the crisis. "The system is patched," I replied, keeping my eyes on the heavy machine sliding into my canvas bag. "The data is secure." The bank is open. You're safe now, both of you. Hoisting the heavy strap over my shoulder, I forced the heavy urge to stay into rigid professionalism, choosing to leave before I ruined the sanctuary I had helped secure. Reluctant to overstay my welcome or make her feel obligated, I walked toward the aluminum door, the same threshold where this had all started weeks ago. Finn, my boot stopped moving. Rather than turning around immediately, I took a deep, steadying breath to prepare myself for a polite, professional goodbye. Then, I faced her. Kamiyah walked forward, but she didn't stop a foot away this time. Stepping directly into my space, her presence was a quiet, undeniable force demanding full attention. Reaching out, she took the strap of my bag, sliding it gently but firmly off my shoulder. It was a concrete action, a public choice in the privacy of her sanctuary. She set the bag heavily on the floor. From her pocket, a small, silver key emerged. It was the spare key to the RV, the physical access to the farm's central hub. But more than that, it was an anchor, a tether. "I don't want you to be a ghost in the machine anymore," she said quietly, holding the key out. Her eyes locked onto mine with absolute certainty, stripping away all my philosophical distance and defensive logic. "I need a permanent systems administrator on this farm. I want you here, not as a drifter, as a partner." Reaching up, her hands framed my face. The touch wasn't frantic or rushed. It was the quiet weight of arrival. When our lips met, it felt like the final line of code locking perfectly into place. It wasn't an exploration. It was a destination. The endless, drifting calculations in my mind simply ceased. The wandering had stopped. It was heavy, grounding, and absolute. A promise sealed without words. Wrapping my arms around her secured not a defense against the world, but a true belonging within it. Closing thoughts. I learned that you cannot calculate the value of a life through algorithms or maintain safety through distance. True connection isn't about maintaining a perfect attachment. It's about choosing to be the anchor when the ground shakes. Real love isn't about drama. It's about consistency, safety, and showing up. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this. The end.